The desert was silent that morning, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and seeps into your bones. The sun had only just begun its climb, painting the sand in muted golds and the distant mesas in long, jagged shadows. Taza, a lone Apache scout, moved carefully over the rocky terrain. He had spent years tracking, hunting, and surviving in this harsh land. But today something felt different, an uneasy tension in the air. As if the desert itself were holding its breath, he was following the faint tracks of a coyote when he saw it. A figure collapsed near the dry riverbed, half buried in sand and dust. At first he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the sun's heat, but as he approached, the shape shifted slightly. A woman, alone, injured, almost lifeless. Taza's instincts sharpened. He crouched low, studying her cautiously. Her clothing was tattered and torn, remnants of a journey that had clearly been brutal. Her face was streaked with dirt and blood, and her hair clung to her cheeks in damp clumps. But what caught him most was her eyes. They were wide and burning with a strange mixture of fear and defiance. Even in her weakened state, there was a fire there, a spark that refused to be extinguished. He moved closer, keeping his hands visible and calm. "Are you alive?" he asked in his soft, measured voice. The woman stirred weakly, letting out a low, ragged breath. She tried to speak but could only whisper something indistinct. As if her voice had been drained along with her strength, Taza knew he had to act quickly. The sun was rising fast, and the desert offered no mercy to the weak. He knelt beside her, gently checking her for injuries. Bruises covered her arms and legs, and a deep gash ran along her side, oozing dark blood. Her lips were cracked and pale. She had been on her own for days, maybe longer. He wrapped his arms around her, careful not to hurt her further, and lifted her as best he could. She was lighter than expected, but she did not resist, merely letting her body sag against his. Every step back toward his hidden canyon shelter was deliberate, avoiding loose stones and sudden dips in the terrain. His mind was alert, analyzing every shadow, every sound. The desert was not safe, but he had seen enough hardship to know he could protect her. At least for now. As he carried her, Taza noticed small details that spoke volumes about her journey. The calluses on her hands told of someone used to hard work, perhaps farming or climbing over rough terrain. The streaks of ash and dirt on her face hinted at fires she had crawled through or slept beside for warmth. And beneath all of that, he sensed something unspoken, a resilience that had kept her alive against odds that would have broken most people. Finally, he reached the hidden canyon that served as his home, a secluded place shielded by cliffs and dense scrub. He lowered her onto a bed of soft furs and blankets he had laid out in anticipation of such encounters. She whimpered softly, turning her face toward him with exhaustion that seemed to seep into her very bones. Taza knelt beside her, unsure of what he would find when she woke. Would she be grateful? Fearful? Or would she lash out at him as someone who had trusted and been betrayed might? Whatever her reaction, he knew one thing clearly. She was alive now, and for that moment, that was enough. He would protect her not because he owed her anything, but because he could not ignore a life clinging to the edge of death. The desert stretched beyond the canyon, vast and unforgiving, but inside this hidden refuge, the first fragile threads of trust had begun to weave themselves. Taza's eyes met hers once more, and though she did not fully understand yet, she was no longer alone. Aloya stirred slowly, blinking against the dim light of the canyon shelter. The morning sun filtered in through the narrow opening in the rocks, casting golden beams across the blankets that cradled her fragile body. Every muscle ached, every breath felt like fire in her chest. But beneath the pain, there was a faint pulse of life, a stubborn insistence that she had not yet given up. Her eyes fluttered open. Meeting the calm, watchful gaze of Taza, he sat nearby. tending to a small fire that would warm the water for her to drink. There was no hint of judgment in his expression, only quiet concern. Aloya's lips parted and she tried to speak, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper, almost swallowed by the cavern walls. Thank you, she rasped. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt monumental. Taza nodded once, acknowledging her words but saying nothing. Words seemed unnecessary here. Actions had spoken louder than any phrase could dot as she gained strength over the next few hours. Aloya began to explain, her voice barely above a whisper. She was from a distant Apache band, one that had been attacked months before. Raiders had swept through her village, leaving death and destruction in their wake. She had fled, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a grief that weighed heavier than any pack she could have borne. She had no family left, no tribe, no home. Taza listened quietly, absorbing each word without interruption. The canyon around them was silent except for the crackling fire, but in that silence he felt the weight of her story, the sorrow woven into every syllable. He had known loss too, though his tribe remained. He understood the void left by a broken family, by those torn away before their time. Aloya's eyes darted around the shelter, wary and guarded. The world had not been kind to her, and trust came slowly, like water trickling into a dry riverbed. She could not yet believe that someone would take her in without asking for anything in return. She expected a price, a demand, or at the very least, suspicion. Yet Taza offered none of that. She spoke again, her words trembling. I have nothing left. No one to turn to. I am alone. The ache in her voice was raw and unfiltered. Taza's gaze softened, and he shook his head gently. He did not try to fill the emptiness with words of pity. He knew that would mean nothing. Instead, he simply handed her a bowl of warm water. Placing it where she could reach it easily. As Aloya drank, she realized the depth of her vulnerability. She had wandered across deserts, hidden from enemies, and survived only by sheer will. But now, for the first time, she was not alone. There was someone who saw her not as a lost, broken soul, but as a person worthy of life and dignity. This recognition, small as it seemed, stirred something fragile inside her, a glimmer of hope, almost forgotten amidst the shadows of grief and fear. Still, the fear of being a burden lingered. I should not stay, she whispered, her gaze lowering to the blankets beneath her. You do not owe me anything. Taza finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. No debt is owed here. You are alive, and that is enough. His words were simple, but for Aloya, they resonated like a song she had long forgotten. No expectation. No demand. Just acceptance. For the rest of the day, Aloya remained quiet, observing Taza as he prepared food, mended his own small injuries, and organized the shelter. She noticed the small acts of care, the way he moved with purpose, the calm patience in his hands, the respect he seemed to carry not only for her, but for the land and its creatures. It was a language of compassion that did not need words. By the time the sun began its descent behind the canyon walls, Aloya felt a subtle shift within herself. She had expected suspicion, rejection, perhaps even anger from a stranger. Instead, she found safety. And in that safety, for the first time in months, the relentless ache of loss was joined by a fragile thread of trust. Though she had no tribe, no family, and no home, in the quiet sanctuary of the canyon and in the steady presence of Taza, Aloya sensed that perhaps she could start again. Perhaps life had not abandoned her completely. As days passed in the quiet sanctuary of the canyon, Aloya's body began to regain its strength. Her wounds slowly healed under Taza's careful hands, and her appetite returned in small, cautious bites. Each day she felt a little more alive, though the shadow of fear and shame lingered within her. She was acutely aware that she had nothing to offer in return for the life Taza had saved. No family, no skills that could immediately prove useful, no possessions, just herself. One evening, as the last golden rays of sunlight spilled into the canyon, Aloya sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. Taza had gone to check the traps he had set near the canyon entrance. Alone, she allowed her mind to wander into the darkest corners of her thoughts, the corners that whispered of desperation, of worth measured only in what one could give. She remembered the old stories from her tribe before it was destroyed. Tales of debt and survival, of the unwritten laws that demanded payment for every favor. In her mind, a single thought grew insistent. If she could offer something, perhaps then she would feel she had not become a burden. A useless survivor lingering at the mercy of another dot. By the time Taza returned, Aloya had made up her mind. She stood unsteadily, her hands trembling slightly. When he approached, she met his gaze with eyes that were both pleading and ashamed. The words tumbled out, hesitant at first, then faster, as if speaking them aloud could somehow lessen the weight of her desperation. I can repay you," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I can give you myself, my body. It's all I have left to offer for saving me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged, and for a moment Taza said nothing. He stopped in his tracks, looking at her with an expression that was neither anger nor amusement, but one of stunned silence and careful consideration. The canyon seemed to hold its breath along with him. Aloya's heart pounded. She had expected many reactions: anger, rejection, even disgust. She had prepared herself for humiliation, for a refusal so harsh it would confirm every fear she had carried since her tribe's destruction. But Taza's eyes were calm, unshaken, and impossibly steady. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "No?" The single word struck her like a thunderclap. "No?" She repeated, her voice barely audible, trembling with disbelief. You saved me, and you refuse what I offer?" Taza knelt beside her, lowering himself to her level. There was no judgment in his gaze, no impatience, only a quiet, unwavering dignity. "Among my people," he said, "a life saved is not a debt owed. You are alive, and that is enough. You owe me nothing, not your body, not your loyalty, not even words of thanks. You owe nothing but your own life and the choice to live it freely." Aloya's throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes. She had expected to feel relief at being accepted, but instead she felt confusion, awe, and a sense of something almost foreign: respect. This man had saved her life not for gain, not for obligation, not for selfish desire. He had saved her simply because it was the right thing to do. Her mind spun, trying to comprehend it. In a world where she had always believed that every act of kindness had a price, here was one that asked nothing. It was a concept she had never encountered, and yet it was offered without hesitation, without expectation. For the first time since the attack on her village, Aloya allowed herself to breathe freely. She felt a tight coil of shame in her chest loosen slightly, replaced by a fragile thread of hope. Perhaps she could survive without sacrificing herself to repay debts that were never hers to owe. Perhaps life had more to offer than suffering and obligation. Taza rose and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture of reassurance. "Rest now," he said. "Eat, sleep, heal. You are not a burden here." That night, as Aloya lay wrapped in blankets near the fire, she stared into the dancing flames. Her body ached, but for the first time in months, her spirit felt the faint stirrings of something stronger than fear. She did not yet understand what lay ahead, or what this unexpected kindness would demand of her, but she knew one thing: In the presence of Taza, the rules she had lived by no longer applied. For the first time, she felt she might belong somewhere again. The night settled over the canyon with a quiet intensity, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the rocks. Aloya lay wrapped in the soft blankets Taza had provided, staring at the flickering fire and replaying the events of the day in her mind. She could not shake the disbelief that still clung to her chest, a heavy weight that pressed down on her like the desert heat at noonday. She had expected judgment, ridicule, perhaps even anger when she made her desperate offer. Instead, Taza had simply said, no. That one word had struck her to the core, not in cruelty, but in clarity. For the first time, she realized that someone could see her as more than just a body, more than a burden, more than a survivor clinging to the edges of life. Taza moved quietly around the small shelter, arranging supplies, sharpening a knife, and tending to the fire. Each motion was deliberate, calm, and careful, as if the very act of being present carried weight. Aloya watched him from her blankets, her thoughts tangled with confusion and awe. She had wandered through death and devastation alone for so long. And yet here, in this hidden canyon, a stranger had chosen to see her as human first. In desperate second, she wanted to speak, to ask why he refused her offer, why he had saved her without demanding anything in return. But the words felt inadequate, incapable of conveying the storm of emotions churning inside her. Instead, she simply observed him, noting the small details, the way he handled the tools with steady precision, the calm set in his jaw, the subtle attentiveness in his eyes. Everything about him radiated patience and respect, qualities she had believed were extinct in a world so cruel. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? Taza turned to face her, his expression neutral but thoughtful. Why what? He asked. Why? Why did you save me? She asked, struggling to meet his gaze. Why did you refuse what I offered? Why are you not angry? Taza knelt down beside her again, his eyes locking with hers. Because a life is never owed. Saving someone is not a transaction, he said simply. It is not given with strings, nor should it be taken as a favor to be repaid with shame. You are alive. That alone is enough. Aloya felt a lump form in her throat. Her past had been filled with calculation, with survival dictated by debt, obligation, and fear. Every act of kindness she had encountered had been tainted by expectation. Every help she had received demanded something in return, sometimes payment, sometimes loyalty, sometimes the ultimate sacrifice. But here, in the quiet canyon, she encountered something utterly alien, pure, unselfish kindness. She tried to imagine it in other terms. In her own life, her own experiences, but the concepts twisted in her mind. Could there really be a world in which acts of compassion existed without cost? Could someone truly see her as a person, not an object to be used? Taza seemed to sense her internal struggle. He extended a hand, gently brushing back a strand of hair from her face. Do not mistake my actions for weakness or naivety, he said quietly. I have known loss. I have seen suffering. But the measure of a person is not in what they demand in return, but in what they give freely. You are alive because I chose to save you, not because I expected anything, but because it was right. Aloya's tears fell then, hot and unexpected. She had not cried in months, not since her village had been destroyed, not since the cold desert nights had forced her to cling to life alone. Now in this quiet canyon, she let herself release the grief and fear she had carried for so long. Taza did not speak further. He merely sat beside her, offering presence instead of words, solidarity instead of advice. Aloya realized then that this was another form of the unexpected, a quiet strength that did not seek to dominate, to demand, or to judge. It was a strength born of respect, patience, and an unwavering moral clarity. As the night deepened, Aloya lay back against the blankets, her mind still racing but her heart slowly easing. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the rocks, and she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a long time: safety. Not just physical safety, but emotional safety, a place where she could exist as herself, without fear of exploitation or betrayal. In Taza's unexpected answer, she sensed a path forward, one that would require trust and courage, but also promised healing. The rules she had clung to for survival, rules of desperation and obligation, were no longer the only way. For the first time, Aloya realized that she might not only survive, but live. And perhaps, in time, she might even learn what it meant to belong. The days passed slowly in the secluded canyon, each one marked by a rhythm dictated by nature and survival. The sun rose and fell, casting long shadows across the rocks, and the nights were filled with the cries of distant coyotes and the whispering wind. For Aloya, this place had become more than a refuge. It had become a place of quiet rebirth. Her body, once frail and broken, began to regain strength. Taza had taught her how to tend to her wounds, using herbs he collected from the canyon's hidden nooks. He showed her which leaves could reduce swelling, which roots could ease pain, and how to wrap cuts and bruises properly. Aloya watched him carefully, absorbing every lesson. She had expected instruction to be harsh or impatient, but Taza's guidance was always patient, deliberate, and calm. Each day, she would rise with the sun and move with him to the small garden of wild plants he had cultivated. She learned to grind corn, sift flour, and boil water safely over the fire. The work was slow at first, each movement awkward and unpracticed, but her muscles began to remember strength she had almost forgotten she possessed. She marveled at her own progress, a faint but persistent pride stirring in her chest. Taza's presence was steady and unassuming. He did not force conversation, but when he spoke, his words carried lessons beyond survival. He told her stories of the stars, teaching her to navigate by their patterns. He shared tales of Apache ancestors, of warriors who had faced impossible odds, not as glorified heroes, but as people who endured because they valued life and honor. Through these lessons, Aloya began to understand the canyon as more than a place of shelter. It was a teacher, a crucible in which she could forge herself anew. Yet it was not just her body that healed. Aloya's spirit, long weighed down by grief and loss, began to stir with a fragile hope. Each day spent under Taza's guidance reminded her that life could still be lived with dignity, even after unimaginable suffering. She laughed softly when she made mistakes, tasting the simple joy of learning and growing. She began to imagine a future where her survival was not merely a matter of endurance, but of choice. The bond between her and Taza deepened as well. They did not need words for everything sometimes. A glance or a gesture was enough to convey understanding. He respected her space, never prying, never demanding, and she found herself trusting him in ways she had not trusted anyone since her tribe was lost. The canyon, with its hidden springs and protective cliffs, became a sanctuary not just for her body, but for her heart. Aloya began to explore the canyon more boldly, climbing rocky ridges, learning to track the small creatures that lived there, and identifying the plants that could nourish or heal. She realized that the world was both harsh and beautiful, full of dangers and wonders, and that survival was not simply about fleeing pain, but learning to navigate it with skill and awareness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Aloya and Taza sat together by the fire. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. Aloya felt a sense of calm she had not known in months, a quiet certainty that she was reclaiming herself piece by piece. She glanced at Taza, who was sharpening his knife with methodical precision, and a thought struck her. He had saved her not just from death, but from despair. He had given her the tools, both physical and spiritual, to live again. She reached for a handful of water, letting her fingers linger on the smooth river stones as she considered how far she had come. She had arrived at the canyon nearly dead, broken by loss, fear, and loneliness. Now she could see herself beginning to rise from the ashes of that suffering, learning to walk, to fight, and to live once more. And yet, beneath the gratitude and growing strength, there remained a quiet tension, a reminder of the dangers that existed beyond the canyon walls. She knew the world outside was not as forgiving as Taza, not as patient or protective. But for the first time, she did not feel powerless against it. She was learning to trust herself, and in that trust lay the seed of courage. The canyon had become more than a shelter. It had become a classroom, a forge, and a home. And under the watchful eyes of Taza, Aloya began to understand that healing was not simply about recovering the body, it was about reclaiming the right to hope, the strength to act, and the courage to live fully once more. The canyon, once a place of quiet rebirth, began to echo with the shadows of Aloya's past. Though her body had regained strength and her spirit had begun to heal, the memories she carried remained raw and insistent. At night, when the fire dwindled to embers and the canyon was cloaked in darkness, the images returned vivid and relentless. She saw the flames that had consumed her village, heard the screams that had pierced the desert night, and felt again the hands of strangers tearing apart the life she had known. One evening, after a long day of gathering herbs and sharpening her hunting skills, Aloya sat at the edge of the canyon, staring at the horizon. The cliffs cast long shadows that seemed to stretch into her mind, mingling with the images she could not escape. Her hands shook slightly as she traced the lines of her scars, both visible and invisible. She had thought she could leave the past behind, but it had a stubborn hold, tugging at her heart with every heartbeat. "I should leave," she whispered, almost to herself. The words felt like a confession. "I shouldn't burden him with my memories, with my fears. He doesn't owe me safety, and I cannot expect to stay here forever." Taza, who had been quietly observing from a short distance, approached slowly. He did not speak immediately, sensing that Aloya needed to voice her turmoil in her own time. When he finally knelt beside her, his presence was steady, unintrusive, but impossibly strong in its simplicity. "You think you must carry the past alone," he said softly. "But it is not weakness to remember. It is human. It is what makes survival meaningful. You do not have to face it in isolation." Aloya's voice cracked as she spoke. "But every time I close my eyes, I see them, the raiders, the flames, my family. Gone. I feel powerless. I fear it will happen again, that the world will take everything from me, and I will have nothing to fight with except anger and fear." Taza nodded, understanding more than she could see. "Fear is not an enemy," he said. "It is a guide. It teaches caution, patience, and respect for what is beyond your control. But you are not powerless. You have survived where others would have perished. You have learned strength, endurance, and skill. You have a choice in how you face what comes next." Her gaze dropped to her hands, trembling slightly. "I am not like you," she murmured. "I am not a warrior. I am broken." "Broken is only the shape of yesterday," Taza replied. "What you are today is different. You are learning. You are growing. And you are not alone." The words were simple, but they cut through the tangle of guilt and fear that had wrapped itself around Aloya's heart. For a moment, the past seemed almost manageable, as if speaking it aloud in the presence of someone who truly listened could lessen its weight. But the shadow of her instinct to flee remained. She thought of the desert beyond the canyon walls, wide and unending, and of the threats that could appear without warning. She had spent so long surviving alone that the idea of trusting, Someone of staying in one place felt both comforting and terrifying. Could she risk attachment only to lose it again? Could she allow herself to feel belonging without inviting more pain? Taza placed a hand on her shoulder, firm yet gentle. You cannot erase the past, Aloya, but you can choose how it shapes your future. You have survived because you are strong. You can survive again not by running, but by standing, by preparing, and by trusting the strength you already carry within you. She inhaled deeply, letting the words sink in. The fear was still there, flickering in the corners of her mind, but the presence of Taza, the canyon, and the quiet certainty of her own growing strength offered a counterbalance. She realized that running away would not bring safety, it would only prolong the grip of the past. She had to face it, learn from it, and shape her life in spite of it. As the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, painting the rocks in hues of gold and crimson, Aloya felt a small, fragile resolve form within her. She would not let the past dictate her every action. She would not allow herself to be defined solely by loss and fear. For the first time since the destruction of her village, she felt the stirrings of courage, not the desperate courage of mere survival, but the deliberate courage of someone beginning to reclaim her life. And though the shadows of the past would always linger, she understood now that they did not have to control her. She would stay. She would learn. And when the time came, she would face whatever lay beyond the canyon, not as a broken survivor, but as a woman reborn. The canyon had become a crucible for Aloya's transformation. Every morning she awoke with the rising sun, her body still carrying the soreness of yesterday's exertions, but her spirit strengthened by purpose. Taza had begun training her in ways she had never imagined. The lessons went beyond mere survival. They were about precision, patience, and learning to trust herself in the face of danger. At first, the exercises were simple: climbing rocky ridges, balancing across narrow ledges, and observing the movement of animals in the canyon. Taza would follow, silently watching her every motion, occasionally offering a correction or gentle encouragement. Aloya's muscles ached in ways they had never ached before, but for the first time she felt capable rather than broken. Each step, each careful movement, was a victory over the fear that had once defined her. Then came the lessons of the hunt. Taza taught her to track footprints in the sand, read broken branches for signs of passage, and listen for the subtle shifts in wind that carried scents across the canyon. He showed her how to move silently, to blend with shadows, and to anticipate danger before it arrived. Aloya learned quickly. Her body, once weakened by injury and grief, now moved with a newfound agility and confidence. She discovered that she could endure more than she had ever believed, and that her instincts, honed by months of desperate survival, were sharper than she had imagined. Beyond physical skill, Taza also emphasized mental preparation. He would ask her to anticipate threats, to plan escape routes, and to consider the consequences of every action. At first, Aloya resisted, feeling impatient with the slow, deliberate methods. But over time, she began to see the wisdom in his teachings. Every choice carried weight, and every precaution could mean the difference between life and death. One afternoon, while practicing tracking along a narrow ridge, Aloya froze at the sound of a branch snapping. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively crouched, blending into the rocks. Taza appeared beside her, silent and steady, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Calm," he whispered. "Observe. Think. Do not act before you know what you face." Aloya followed his advice, her breathing slow and deliberate. Moments later, a small group of deer appeared in the clearing below. Her body had reacted with instinct, but her mind had remained in control. She realized then that she had begun to merge skill and instinct into something greater than either alone. She was learning to become a warrior, not out of desire for violence, but out of necessity for survival and self-reliance. Evenings in the canyon were spent reflecting on the day's lessons. Aloya would sit by the fire, sharpening her small knives or tending to the plants she had helped cultivate. Taza rarely interrupted her thoughts, allowing silence to carry its own lessons. Over time, she began to see herself in a new light, not as a helpless survivor, but as a woman capable of defending herself, capable of making decisions that mattered. Her confidence grew alongside her physical strength. She began to move through the canyon with purpose, her eyes sharp, her steps deliberate. She could navigate hidden paths, anticipate the behavior of animals, and even improvise tools from natural materials. The girl who had collapsed in the desert was no longer the same person. She had been reforged in the heat of hardship and the steady guidance of Taza, yet the most profound change was internal. Aloya's heart, once heavy with fear and grief, now held a quiet certainty. She understood that strength was not measured by brute force alone, but by resilience, awareness, and the courage to confront one's own limitations. The canyon had been her refuge, but it had also been her forge. By the end of the 7th week in the canyon, Aloya moved with a grace and confidence that even Taza noted. "You have learned much," he said quietly one evening as they sat watching the sun dip behind the cliffs. "But remember, strength is not only in the body. It is in the mind and the spirit. Never forget that, Aloya." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words. For the first time since she had been found nearly dead in the desert, she felt whole, not because her past had been erased, but because she had chosen to rise above it. She was no longer merely surviving. She was ready to live, to act, and to face whatever challenges awaited beyond the sanctuary of the canyon. A warrior had been reborn not from bloodlust or vengeance, but from resilience, guidance, and the quiet determination to reclaim her life. The tranquility of the canyon, which had once seemed unshakable, began to feel fragile. Aloya had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life there, the rising sun, the careful routines of survival, the quiet companionship of Taza, but she had learned from her past that danger could appear without warning. That awareness now returned, not as paranoia, but as instinct. It began with subtle signs. Broken branches on a distant ridge. Footprints pressed into soft sand where none should have been. A distant cry that could have been a bird or could have been something else. Aloya noticed these signs first, her trained eyes catching the nuances that others might miss. She moved with deliberate caution, scanning the horizon, listening to the canyon's whispers. Taza, observing her, nodded with approval at her growing vigilance. "The world outside does not forgive mistakes," he said. "You have learned to survive here. But survival beyond the canyon will require more than skill. It will require awareness, patience, and courage." Aloya's heart tightened at the thought of the world beyond the canyon. The desert was wide, harsh, and unforgiving. Raiders and strangers lurked everywhere, ready to take advantage of the weak. She had survived months alone before finding this refuge, and the memories of her destroyed village haunted her. Fear, once a constant companion, now fueled her focus. She would not be caught unprepared again. Days passed, and the signs of intruders became more pronounced. Footprints multiplied along the canyon's hidden paths. Distant fires appeared on the horizon, and the wind carried faint shouts that were unmistakably human. Taza's eyes grew sharp, his movements deliberate. He prepared traps, checked weapons, and observed the canyon's entrances with a calculated vigilance. Aloya followed his lead, moving alongside him with the confidence of someone who had learned not just to survive, but to anticipate danger. One afternoon, as they scouted the outer ridges, Aloya caught sight of a small band of raiders in the distance, men she did not recognize, but whose intent was clear. They moved with the same ruthless efficiency she had seen in the attackers who had destroyed her village. Her stomach clenched, and for a moment, a flicker of fear returned. But she pushed it aside, drawing on the training she had received. She was no longer helpless. She was ready. Taza crouched beside her, pointing silently to cover behind a boulder. "Observe," he whispered. "Do not act until you understand what you face." Aloya watched the men carefully. Their movements were predictable, but dangerous. Each step they took could reveal their intentions. She noted the way they carried their weapons, the way they scanned the terrain, and how they communicated with one another through gestures. Her body, honed through weeks of rigorous training, responded instinctively, her eyes sharp, her muscles coiled. Her mind planning several moves ahead. The canyon, once a sanctuary, was now the stage for a test she had long anticipated. She realized that her time of preparation had led to this moment, the culmination of her training, her healing, and her newfound courage. She was no longer the terrified girl who had collapsed in the desert. She was a warrior, capable of facing threats with skill and clarity. As the raiders drew closer, Aloya felt a surge of determination. She would not flee, nor would she allow herself to be overpowered. She and Taza moved with coordinated precision, setting traps and preparing the canyon's natural advantages to their favor. Every rock, every ledge, every shadow became part of their strategy. Standing beside Taza, she felt the full measure of her transformation. Fear remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a guide, a reminder of the stakes, a fuel for action. She had survived devastation once, and she would survive again, not by chance, but by skill, preparation, and the courage she had cultivated in the quiet sanctuary of the canyon. As the first of the raiders came into view, Aloya took a deep breath, steadying her pulse. She knew this was more than a test of survival. It was the moment that would prove the warrior she had become. And she was ready. The first rays of dawn touched the canyon, casting long shadows over the jagged rocks and hidden crevices. Aloya crouched beside Taza, her senses alert, her body coiled like a spring. The raiders had entered the territory under the cover of darkness, but now the light revealed their movements. They were cautious, but inexperienced in navigating the canyon's intricate paths. Aloya's heart thumped steadily, not with fear, but with focused anticipation. Taza whispered instructions, and Aloya followed each one with precision. She had learned to observe first, strike second, and always be aware of the terrain. The canyon, once a haven, had become a strategic advantage. Rocks, ledges, and hidden paths were all part of the plan, and Aloya moved with a fluidity that surprised even herself. The raiders advanced cautiously, unaware of the traps and diversions laid out by the pair. Aloya's eyes flicked to each shadow, each movement, calculating the most effective way to slow and confuse the attackers. Taza's presence beside her was a grounding force. His calm, deliberate movements reminded her that this was not just about survival, but about mastery. The first clash came unexpectedly. A raider slipped into a narrow pass, his foot catching on a hidden snare. A rope yanked him off balance, and he fell with a grunt, tumbling harmlessly into a shallow pit Aloya had prepared. She allowed herself a brief, satisfied breath. Skill and preparation were proving their worth. The other raiders reacted quickly, drawing weapons and calling to one another. Aloya's training kicked in instinctively. She moved silently along a ledge above them, her arrows finding their marks with unerring accuracy. Taza was just ahead, intercepting those who tried to flank them, using both his knowledge of the land and precise, calculated force. For Aloya, the battle was a test of everything she had learned. Her muscles remembered the climbs, the jumps, the stealth movements she had practiced for weeks. Her mind calculated every angle, every path, anticipating the raiders' reactions. For the first time since her village had been destroyed, she felt control, not over life or death, which was never guaranteed, but over her own actions and choices. The raiders pressed forward, but the canyon itself worked against them. Aloya and Taza moved with a near-perfect coordination, forcing the attackers into traps, into blind spots, and into positions where they could be disarmed or delayed. Every skill Taza had taught her was being tested simultaneously. Awareness, patience, precision, and courage. At one point, a raider tried to charge Aloya directly. She sidestepped, using the momentum against him to guide him into a trap she had set. The man stumbled, giving Taza the opportunity to neutralize him safely. Aloya's heart raced, not with fear, but with a sense of achievement and empowerment she had never known. She was not a victim. She was a force capable of protecting herself and standing for what mattered. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. By mid-morning, the raiders were disoriented, their cohesion broken by traps, strategic maneuvers, and the unexpected resistance of the two defenders. Aloya's confidence surged. She had faced the shadow of her past, the same ruthless attackers who had destroyed her home, and now she stood victorious. Not through luck, but through the skills she had painstakingly cultivated. As the last raider fled, stumbling over rocks and disappearing into the desert beyond the canyon, Aloya sank to the ground, breathing heavily but with a sense of exhilaration. Taza placed a steady hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of her achievement. "You have learned well," he said softly. "Not because you survived, but because you understood. Because you chose to act, not react. This is how life is reclaimed after loss, not by running, but by facing what threatens it." Aloya's chest swelled with emotion. She had feared the outside world, feared the pain it could inflict. But through the trial, she realized that the strength she had gained in the canyon was more than physical, it was mental and spiritual. She was no longer the terrified girl who had offered herself in desperation. She was a woman who could protect, endure, and choose her own destiny. As the sun climbed higher, casting the canyon in brilliant light, Aloya finally allowed herself to feel a profound sense of victory. Not over the raiders, but over fear, helplessness, and the chains of her past. She had reclaimed her life, step by step, skill by skill, choice by choice. For the first time in years, she felt free. The canyon was silent once more. The raiders had fled, leaving behind only disturbed sand and the faint echoes of their retreating shouts. Aloya sat on a smooth rock near the fire, her body still humming with the adrenaline of battle. The exhaustion that had once crushed her felt different now, a heavy but satisfying ache that came from strength, skill, and hard-won victory. She had survived. She had fought. And she had triumphed. Taza approached quietly, his movements deliberate and calm. He had fought alongside her, guided her, and watched her transform from a broken, nearly dead girl into a confident, capable warrior. Aloya's heart swelled with gratitude, but also with something unfamiliar, a sense of belonging, of being seen and respected not for what she could give, but for who she was. She rose unsteadily, brushing the dust from her clothes, and turned to him. She began, her voice catching. "I don't know what to say." Taza shook his head gently. "There is nothing you need to say. You have already said everything through your actions." Aloya's gaze dropped to the ground. Memories of her past, the village lost, the family gone. The long months of desperation flickering through her mind. She had once believed that her worth could only be measured in what she could give to others. That survival itself was not enough unless it was paid for with debt or sacrifice. But Taza had shown her something entirely different. Life could be reclaimed not through transactions or desperate offers, but through choice, courage, and resilience. Aloya's thoughts turned to the future. Beyond the canyon lay the desert, wide and uncertain. There were threats she could not anticipate, challenges she could not yet imagine. And yet, for the first time in months, she felt ready, not because the world had become safer, but because she had become stronger. She had reclaimed her body, her mind, and her spirit. She had learned to trust herself, and now she faced a new question. What would she choose? Taza watched her closely, sensing the turmoil within her. "You have a choice, Aloya," he said quietly. "The world outside is vast and unpredictable. You may leave the canyon, follow your own path, or stay. The decision is yours. No one can make it for you. You are free." The word struck her with unexpected force. Free. It was a concept she had not dared imagine for months, perhaps years. To have agency over her own life, to choose her own destiny without obligation or fear, that was the gift Taza had offered all along. Without demanding repayment, without judgment, without expectation, Aloya closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the desert wind carry away the weight of her past. She thought of the girl who had collapsed near the dry riverbed, barely clinging to life. That girl would never have imagined this moment, a moment where her strength, courage, and choice would be hers alone. And yet, here she was. She was no longer the same person. When she opened her eyes, they met Taza's with clarity and resolve. "I choose to stay," she said firmly. "Not because I owe you anything, and not because I fear the desert, but because I want to. Because for the first time, I see that I can belong somewhere with someone who sees me as I am." Taza's expression softened, a rare, quiet smile forming on his lips. "Then stay," he said simply. "You are welcome here, always." Aloya felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of relief, pride, and newfound hope. She realized that the unexpected gift Taza had given her was not merely survival, it was the ability to make her own choices, to shape her own destiny, and to walk forward with strength and courage. The canyon, once a refuge from the world, had become a home. The fire crackled between them as the sun rose higher, bathing the rocks in golden light. Aloya felt the weight of her past lift slightly with each passing moment, replaced by the certainty that she could face whatever came next, not as a victim, but as a warrior, a survivor, and a woman in command of her own life. She took Taza's hand, a gesture of gratitude and trust, and for the first time, she felt fully alive, not because danger had passed, but because she had reclaimed the power to choose her own path. And in that choice, Aloya understood the true meaning of survival, strength, and belonging. She was free.